Accompanying the industrial expansion and making much of it possible was a technological revolution symbolized by the assembly line and resulting in a vast increase in worker productivity. The 20s was also a time when consumer buying and merchandising mushroomed, encouraging the growth of such chains as A&P and Kresge. To spur consumer demand, business and industry bought time on the popular new medium radio to reach millions of potential customers with their innovating techniques in advertising, which included the use of the newly popular science of psychology in appealing to a buyer's snobbishness, sense of insecurity, or desire to be attractive to the opposite sex. A vast increase in the use of installment credit enabled much of the middle class to acquire the cars, radios, refrigerators, and other new or improved products available in the marketplace. In such a society, it was only natural that many of the heroes should be found among the men who made all these tantalizing delights possible. Samuel Insull, utilities king, and Thomas W. Lamont, international banker, were but two of the period's business heroes to have their pictures on the cover of Time, a new national news magazine. As business boomed, growing numbers of people looked to the stock market as another source of thrills, and few thrills, they agreed, were greater than getting rich quick. By 1928, stock speculation was a national mania. Almost everyone could translate the language of the financial specialist into the plain talk of Main Street. Almost everyone knew someone or knew someone who was dabbling in the market. Many important people assured the country that recessions had been banished forever, that all one had to do to be prosperous was keep his sunny side up. Certainly, the average middle-class American saw ahead of him a limitless vista of prosperity. But not all Americans in the Jazz Age were prosperous and middle class. Throughout the period, industrial workers had to labor long and hard for an income of less than $1,500 a year. Any attempt to improve their lot through unionization and collective bargaining was seen as a communist plot and suppressed accordingly. The epitome of the Red Scare was the 7-year trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, whose ultimate execution was widely felt to be due to their radical politics. They were executed for a payroll robbery and murder, although the evidence against them was flimsy. In fact, prior to the execution, someone else confessed to the crime. From the early 20s on, poverty haunted the nation's farmers. None felt it more keenly than those living in the badly depressed agricultural South. Since this region was still home to most of the nation's black people, little of the Coolidge prosperity ever reached any of them. Blacks who migrated to the North found themselves the victims of unemployment and discrimination in housing. Poverty and unemployment were also the lot of hundreds of thousands of bituminous coal miners, shoemakers, textile and shipbuilding workers whose industries suffered a major decline during the 1920s. This sort of distress, though, went largely unnoticed. "We in America," said Herbert Hoover, the Republican Party's 1928 presidential candidate, "are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever in the history of any land. We shall soon be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation." In October 1929, less than a year after Hoover's election, came the great stock market crash, and the most widespread poverty in the nation's history. Many people were evicted from their homes because they could no longer pay their rent. As unemployment, hunger, and homelessness mounted, the people who had voted for Hoover in such overwhelming numbers made him the scapegoat for their misery. Newspapers were called Hoover blankets, and the shanty towns sprouting on the edges of cities, Hoovervilles. Like a fire out of control, the economic depression soon engulfed the world. This is a demonstration of unemployed in Great Britain. The United States government adopted the highest tariff rates in its history, supposedly to protect U.S. products from foreign competition. But neither the U.S. leaders nor their European counterparts were willing to acknowledge their mutual economic interdependence. The Europeans responded by boycotting American imports. Some industries did benefit, but this cartoon underlines the fact that the farmers were hurt worse than ever. By 1932, when the Depression was most severe and 1 out of every 3 workers was unemployed, many Americans, though still a tiny part of the population, began to seek solutions in radical politics. In Washington, the fear of revolution grew. In July of 1932, 12 to 15,000 homeless World War I veterans, many with their wives and children, descended on the city. They asked for immediate payment of a bonus not due until 1945. The Hoover administration, fearing the beginning of a communist uprising, panicked. The army was ordered to clear out the marchers, which it did, with the aid of tear gas and bayonets. The government's view of these citizens was made clear by the Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, who, in commenting on the operation, said, "I have released in my day more than one community in the grip of a foreign enemy." Hoover's public image by this time was that of a man indifferent to the suffering around him and inactive in trying to relieve it. In fact, Hoover initiated several plans for government intervention to improve the nation's economic health, plans that in many ways laid the basis for the New Deal. Several times between the 1929 crash and mid-1931, Hoover's policies seemed to be creating a significant rise in employment and production. But in June of 1931, Europe's financial structure collapsed and left the American economy in desperate circumstances.